She was 20 and broke. No savings, just her grandmother's brass-handled push drill and $10 she had earned cleaning fish at the marina in Grand Marais. With that $10, she bought an abandoned Boatwright's shed on a small inland lake in Cook County, Minnesota, in a stretch of the North Shore that had not seen a steam-bent ash rib clamped in a form since 2005. The cedar shingle roof had gone the color of weathered bone. The shed doors had bowed away from their hinges. But what nobody knew was that hidden behind the steam box at the far end of the shop was something that would change her life forever. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Hattie Voorhees had grown up in a building that smelled of cedar. Other children had grown up in houses where the smell was cooking, or laundry soap, or the family dog. Hattie had grown up next to a small lakeside shed, where the air was always sweet with cedar shavings, and the faint renews bite of marine spar varnish, where her grandmother's bandsaw made a steady singing whine in the late afternoons, and where the long curve of a freshly planked canoe pale green gold against the dim shop interior was the first beautiful thing she had ever known how to recognize. Her grandmother built wooden canoes, not the aluminum kind, not the plastic kind. The kind that had been built in Minnesota and Wisconsin since the 1880s, when a generation of Dutch and Norwegian and Ojibwe boat rides had figured out how to take a sheet of cedar plank and a bundle of steam-bent ash ribs and a few pounds of brass screws and turn them into something light enough for a single woman to carry on her shoulders over a portage and strong enough to hold a moose hunter on Lake Saginaga in October. Hattie had been in the shed on Saturdays since she could walk. Her grandmother's name was Ida Voorhees, born Ida Vanlin, and she had been a wooden canoe builder at her own one-woman shop on the western shore of Devil Track Lake for 43 years. Ida had inherited the trade from her father, a fine Dutch immigrant named Peter Vanlin, who had come from the boat-building village of Stavoren in 1909 with a fishing boat builder certificate and a canvas duff of tools, who had taken the long train north out of St. Paul, looking for cold water and good white cedar, and had found both on the inland lakes above Lake Superior. On a June morning in 1910, he had stood on the shore of Devil Track and watched a Voyager birchbark canoe slide across the surface with a single Ojibwe paddler in the stern, and had decided that this was the country where he would build boats. By the end of his first year, he had built a small cedar shingled shed on a quarter-acre of shoreline he had bought for $30 cash. And inside that shed, he had built the steam box, the canoe forms, the workbench, and the rib clamp rack that would make the family trade. That shed was the same shed that still stood. The same steam box still bolted to the same plank floor, and the family had built canoes in it without missing a season for 95 years. Hattie's mother was Joni Voorhees, who had been 31 when Hattie was born, and who had grown up in the shed, but had decided at 16 that she wanted nothing to do with a trade that left cedar dust in her hair. Joni had moved to Duth, married a man who installed septic tanks, divorced him, married a second man who sold used cars who had lasted 4 years. Hattie's father had been the first man. She had not seen him since she was 3. Joni had raised Hattie in a small apartment above a hardware store in Duth until Hattie was 7, when she had moved them up to Grand Marais to be closer to Ida. From 7 on, Hattie had spent every Saturday and every summer at her grandmother's shed. This past winter, Joni had met a third man, a heavy equipment mechanic named Russ Bratland, and Russ had moved into the small frame house Joni had bought after the second divorce. Russ wanted the second bedroom for his fishing gear and his ham radio, and on a Tuesday morning in early May, Joni had told Hattie over coffee that she had decided Russ should stay and that Hattie should look for her own place. Hattie had finished her coffee, washed her cup, gone upstairs, and packed everything she owned into 2 duffel bags inside of an hour. She was 20. What Hattie had instead for all those 13 years was her grandmother. Ida Voorhees lived alone in a small frame house behind the boat shed on Devil Track Lake. She had been a widow since 1981. Her husband Cornelius had been a logging truck driver who had died when his rig jackknifed on a logging road outside Taft. Ida had been 46. She had never remarried. She had only ever had one child, Joni. And Joni was a daughter she loved but did not understand. After that, there was only Hattie. Ida did not say this in words, but Hattie knew it the way children know things, by the small canvas apron her grandmother kept on a peg for her, the size of a child's, sewn from the same cotton duck Ida used for caning, by the small ashandled push drill Ida had bought for her 6th birthday, so she could drill her own pilot holes for the brass screws. The shed was a long single-room building with a peaked cedar shingle roof and a small lakeside door that opened onto a wooden landing where the finished canoes were launched. The walls were rough-cut tamarack plank gone gray with age. The floor was thick oak planking laid over 6x6 joists. Along the east wall ran the canoe form, a cedar and plywood mold 16 ft long that Peter had built in 1910, and that every Vanlin canoe since had been planked over. Above the form hung the rib clamp rack, dozens of cast iron C-clamps Ida had bought one at a time, over 43 years from estate sales and auctions. Along the west wall ran the workbench. At the south end, against the back wall, stood the steam box, a wooden iron rectangle the size of a small coffin, cast iron firebox below, brass steam vent on top, where ash ribs 1/8 of an inch thick were steamed for 25 minutes until they would bend without splitting. The steam box was the heart of the shop. Without it, no canoe. By 6, Hattie could grade ash by hand. Ida had taught her the cuts of the trade, the difference between first growth straight grain and second growth wavy grain, between summer wood, porous and dark, and winter wood, dense and pale, between an ashboard that would steam bend without breaking, and one that would split the moment it left the box. By 8, Ida let her work the steam box treadle. The small girl pumping the foot pedal that kept the firebox blower going, while Ida fed ash ribs in through the top and pulled them out 25 minutes later in a cloud of hot wet wood smelling steam. "Pace, Misha," Ida would say. "Pace, the fire wants the same air. Faster and it roars, slower and it dies. Pace." By 10, Hattie was bending ribs herself, taking a steamed ash strip in 2 leather-gloved hands and pressing it down onto the canoe form, holding it against the curve until her grandmother's C-clamps came down. The first rib she bent clean and held without splitting on her own was a midship rib for a 15 ft cedar strip special Ida was building for a guide service in Aleli. And Ida had checked the curve with her flat ash measuring stick, run her thumb along the grain to feel for hairline splits, and clamped it in place. She had not said anything. She had not needed to. Hattie had glowed for 3 days. Ida taught Hattie the failures, too. There was a thing she called the blown rib. It was an ash rib left in the steam box too long. 28 minutes instead of 25 cooked past the point where the wood's linen would reset in the new curve. Such a rib would feel pliable in the moment, would clamp into the form looking perfect, would hold its shape for a week. But within a month, as the wood dried out further, the cooked lignon would fail, and the rib would crack along its grain in 3 or 4 places at once, and the entire canoe would have to be rebed. "If you blow a rib," Ida said, holding up a section of cracked ash from a small wooden box she kept on the bench for exactly this purpose, "the canoe will look like a canoe for the first paddle. By August, the customer will say, 'The bottom feels soft and you will have to take it back, strip the canvas, pull every rib and start over. You cannot recover the trip. You cannot recover the canvas. You cannot recover the customer. Do you understand what we are losing?'" Hattie had nodded. She was 12 that summer. From that afternoon forward, she kept a small kitchen timer on a leather lanyard at her belt, set it for 25 minutes the moment she closed the box door, and pulled the rib the instant the bell rang. Ida taught her to read wood with her hands. Cedar plank was a living thing, Ida said, porous on the outer face, denser on the heart side, with a memory of which way the tree had grown and which way it had been carrying water for the 80 years before someone had cut it. Canoe built with the heart side out would weep its varnish in the first season. A canoe built with the heart side in would hold for 30 years. "The wood will tell you," Ida said, "but you have to listen with your fingers. Run your hand against the grain. Where the grain pushes back, that is the bark side. Where it lets your hand slide, that is the heart. Always heart in. Always." By 13, Hattie could lay her palm on a length of cedar plank and tell within 3 seconds which face had to go where on the form. Ida tested her sometimes by setting a board-out blind under the bench light and asking her to call it without looking. She had never gotten it wrong. By 14, Hattie was working full days in the shed through the summer, planking cedar over the form alongside her grandmother, fastening every plank with 8 brass screws driven through pilot holes drilled with the push drill Ida had given her at 6. By 15, she could read it. Length of ash and tell by the curve of the grain at the cut end whether it would take the bend. By 16, she was fitting spruce gunwales, the long top rails that gave a canoe its final shape, and the gunwales she fitted were tight enough that Ida had stopped checking them. By 17, she was caning her own canoe seats from rolls of heavy cotton webbing. 12 seats a year for the canoes that went out the door under her grandmother's name. The trade had become her body. She did not know it was a trade. She thought it was simply what one did on Saturdays and summer afternoons, in a cedar-smelling shed with one's grandmother. There was the time Hattie would always remember from the summer she was 13. It had rained on the North Shore for 18 days without break in late June and early July of 2017. And on the 19th morning, a man named Mr. Olaf Bria from a fishing camp on Saginaga had driven down to the shed with his face the color of cold ash. His twin sister, camping alone in the Boundary Waters for 10 days, had not come back to her vehicle at the Saginaga Putin. The Forest Service had searched 2 days from the air without finding her. Bria had come to ask if Ida still had his old 15 FT cedar strip special on the rack, the one she had built him in 1991, and that he had returned to her on consignment when he had gotten too old to paddle it. He needed a canoe he could trust on water running fast and high. Ida handed him the keys to the rack and helped him load the hull onto his truck herself. Find her, Olaf. Bring her home. He paddled alone for 3 more days in the rain and found his sister on the 4th morning camped on a rocky island at the head of Cypress Lake, soaking wet, hungry, alive. 2 weeks later, he brought the canoe back with a smoked lake trout wrapped in butcher paper. Ida took the fish, told him the canoe was his again, no charge, and told him to take it home and never bring it back. Hattie had been at the bench that morning. She had watched the whole thing happen. Ida taught her the seasons of the trade. In November, when the lakes had frozen and the customers had put their canoes away for the winter, you took new orders and bought your year's lumber. Cedar planking from a mill outside 2 harbors. Ash for ribs from a sawyer near International Falls. Spruce for gunnels cut and planed by a Beige shop that had supplied the family for 40 years. In December and January, you laid out the year's holes on the form. 15 T Winonas, 16 FT cedar strip specials, the occasional 18 FT Voyager ordered by a guide outfitter who needed cargo capacity. In February and March, you steam bent and clamped the ribs, the shed full of the wet, sweet smell of cooking ash. In April and May, you planked cedar over the ribs. In June, you fitted gunnels and seats and thwarts. In July, you canvassed and filled. In August, you varnished 6 coats of marine spar over 7 weeks, sanded between every coat. By the first weekend in September, the canoes went out the lakeside door onto the wooden landing one by one, paddled the half-mile down Devil Track to the dock at the road, loaded onto pickup trucks, and driven away into the Boundary Waters in the inland lakes in the St. Croix and the rivers of Wisconsin. Then in November, the next round of orders came in and you began again. There were stories from the trade Ida would tell while her hands worked at the bench. The story about Mr. Lundvig Sari, who had run an outfitter on the Gunflint Trail for 37 years, and had bought the same cedar strip special from Ida every 4th summer, paid cash on delivery, never a check. He had wept openly the September of 2003, when Ida told him she was raising her price from $1,900 to $2,000, not over the dollar, but over the slow dying of a guide trade he had loved his whole life. The story of the spring of 1987, when a young father from St. Cloud had ordered an 18-foot Voyager for a trip with his 3 sons, and the day before pickup, he had called Ida from a Duth hospital to say his middle son had been diagnosed with leukemia, and the canoe was beyond him. Ida told him to come get it anyway and pay over 5 years. The father paddled it with his other 2 boys all that summer while the middle son had treatment. The boy lived, and the family paddled the canoe together for 19 more years, until he brought it back in 2006 to be sold on consignment for the cancer ward at Duth. The story of a winter in 1992, when a young Ojibwe woman from Grand Portage had walked in asking work, and Ida had given her a winter's wage and taught her to bend ribs in 8 weeks. The woman went on to start her own cedar canvas operation up on Saginaga and named her shop Ida's Daughter. Ida told Hattie stories that were really lessons. Once when Hattie was 11 and had asked why her grandmother bothered building wooden canoes when an aluminum grin could be had for a quarter the price and never needed varnishing. Ida had set down the spoke shave she was using, turned to her and said, "An aluminum canoe is a 2. A wooden canoe is a creature. When you paddle a wooden hull, you can feel the lake through it. You can feel the difference between glacial water and spring water. You can feel a fish swim under you. A grin feels nothing because it is not alive. A cedar canvas canoe is alive because the cedar remembers being a tree. There are people in this country who paddle for the feel of the water. The canoes are for them. That is also the trade. The canoes are how we pay back the people who still want to feel the world through their hands. Hattie had understood this without being able to say it. The canoes were a promise. If you're enjoying this story, take a second and subscribe. It helps us keep making stories like this one. And tell us in the comments, have you ever knelt in a wooden canoe on a still morning and felt the water touching the hull through your knees? Ida died in the autumn of 2005 in her own bed in the small frame house behind the shed. Of a stroke she had been quietly telling no one was coming. Hattie was 7. Joni had been the executive. She sold the shed to settle Ida's last hard years of debts, locked the doors, kept the small frame house herself as a rental in Grand Marais, and gave Hattie nothing of her grandmother's, except the brass-handled push drill from her 6th birthday. The shed had stood unsold and untouched for 19 years. Hattie had walked past it every summer of her childhood and looked at the bowed doors and the weathered shingles and made herself a promise without yet having the words for it. When Joni told her that Tuesday morning in May to find her own place, Hattie packed everything she owned into 2 duffel bags. The push drill in its leather case, a coffee can holding $1,720 from 3 summers cleaning fish at the Grand Marais Marina. 3 changes of clothes. A small framed photograph of Ida at 16 in front of the shed in 1951, with a freshly varnished canoe behind her. A man on Highway 61 outside Tufty had a 1992 Ford F-150 for $1,700 cash. She handed him the money, kept the $20 over, and drove away. For 9 nights, she slept in the cab behind the Lutheran church in Grand Marais, where Pastor Lars Hawkinson had told her the lot was hers as long as she needed. On the 10th morning, Hattie drove the F-150 over to the Cook County Property Office in the small brick courthouse on First Avenue. She had not planned to go in. She had planned to drive past the shed once on Devil Track Lake Road, but as she passed the county office, a thought came to her and she turned the truck around. The clerk behind the counter was a 68-year-old woman in a faded brown cardigan, name tag Mrs. Agnes Berg. Hattie said she had come to ask about the old Boatwright's shed on the western shore of Devil Track. Mrs. Berg's hand stopped halfway to her coffee cup. "Voorhees," she said, "you are Ida's granddaughter." Hattie nodded. Mrs. Berg drew a manila folder out of a bottom drawer and laid it open. The shed had been on the county delinquent tax rolls for 16 years. Nobody had bid on it since 2014. Asking price $10, a placeholder figure. Mrs. Berg slid the deed across, slid a pen after it, and said, "Your grandmother built the cedar strip special. My husband and I paddled for our anniversary trip on Saginaga in 1987. We have it still in our barn." Sign on the bottom line, child. The shed wants you back, Hattie signed. She drove out Devil Track Lake Road in the F-150 with the deed in a folder on the passenger seat and a brass key Mrs. Berg had pulled from her own desk drawer. The shed stood waiting where she remembered it. Long and low, tamarack plank gone gray, cedar shingles weathered to bone. Devil Track Lake stretched out behind it for a mile and a half to a low ridge of spruce on the far shore. Hattie turned the key. The lock gave. She pushed the bowed doors open. The form was still there. Peter's canoe form ran the full length of the east wall, cedar and plywood, the curves of the hull visible under 19 years of dust. The rib clamp rack still held its rows of cast iron C-clamps. The workbench along the west wall held the brass-handled push drill stand, the spoke shaves, the block planes, the beveled edge chisels, all where Ida had left them on her last September. The smell at the door was cedar dust and dry varnish, and the cold mineral smell of cast iron. Hattie stood in the middle of the floor and breathed it for a long minute. She walked the length of the shed to the south wall, where the steam box stood 4 feet off the floor on cast iron, legs the size of a small coffin with a cast iron firebox below for boiling water, and a brass steam vent at the top. The wood of the box was weathered cedar plank sealed at the seams with pitch. Hattie had stood at this steam box more hours than she could count. A memory came back to her then. Edda the summer Hattie was 8, sitting on a wooden stool beside the box and oiling its hinges. "Your great-grandfather Peter was a careful man, Misha. When he built this box in 1910, he set it 2 in away from the back wall so the cast iron would not scorch the tamarack. But behind the box, in that 2-in gap, he built a small hidden cavity. He told me about it the year before he died in 1958. He said it was the place of Van Loon kept the things that mattered. I never opened it." Hattie had forgotten the story for 12 years. She walked around behind the steam box and looked at the back wall. There was the two-in gap, just as Ida had described, and in the back wall of the gap, set into the tamarack planking, was a single removable panel of cedar, about brick-sized, held in place by two wooden pegs. Hattie pulled the pegs out with her fingers. The cedar panel came away clean. Behind it sat a tin box the size of a brick. The lid stamped Peter 1910. She lifted it out with both hands. She lifted the lid. An oilcloth bundle heavy in her hands opened to reveal 212 gold coins, stacked in even rows. Liberty pieces and half-eagles. The savings of a Dutch immigrant who had not trusted American banks. The coin dealer in Duth would later weigh the lot at 22,400. Beneath the bundle, a roll of stiff brown paper tied with twine held Peter's original 1910 hull form drawings. The offsets table for the 15 ft cedar strip special in his careful Dutch language hand, every measurement to the eighth of an inch. Then the leather-bound boat, Ida's own ledger. Every canoe she had ever built, recorded from 1962 through 2005 in her tight slanted hand, and on top of the ledger, sealed with deep blue wax, a folded letter with Hattie's name across the front. Hattie broke the wax with her thumbnail. She sat down on the plank floor beside the steam box and read the letter through once slowly by the gray light coming through the south window. September 22, 2005. Hattie, by the time you find this, I will be gone, and you will have come back to the shed the way I always knew you would. My father Peter put this money behind the steam box in 1910 because he did not trust banks. He told me about the cavity the year before he died and made me promise not to touch it. I have kept the promise. The shop fed us through every year of my life and every year of yours. The shop will not feed you now. Your mother will sell what she can, but this box she cannot sell because she does not know it is here. The drawings are Peter's. Use them. The ledger is the whole record. Build canoes again if it suits you. The form is yours. Maya Voorhees, boat builder. September 22, 2005. Hattie closed the letter into the inside pocket of her grandmother's old forest green wool field jacket. She did not cry. She reached out and ran her thumb along the grain of a partly steam-bent ash rib, still clamped in the form, the last rib her grandmother had bent before the stroke, left in the C-clamps for 19 years, and felt how the wood had taken its curve and remembered it. How the bend had set into the linen and held. The ash was the color of pale honey, the grain was straight and true, into the cedar-smelling air. She said quietly, "Thank you, Mr. Vanlin, I will build canoes again." She drove the F-150 down to the First National Bank of Grand Marais that Monday with the tin box on the passenger seat. Mrs. Fee Hellstrom, the branch manager, weighed the coins on the bank's brass scale, called the dealer in Duth, and confirmed 22,400. Hattie deposited 22,000 and walked back to the truck with 400 folded into the inside pocket of the field jacket. The first month was rebuilding the steam box. The cedar staves had rotted at the bottom, where condensation had pulled. The cast iron firebox had cracked at the throat, where the steam vent fitted. The brass vent was green with corrosion. A copper smith in Two Harbors soldered the firebox throat for $60. Hattie replaced the bottom 3 courses of stave with fresh cedar from a mill outside Luton, fitted the pieces with Ida's spoke shave, sealed every seam with marine pitch, polished the brass vent with vinegar and salt until it shone. The first time she lit the firebox, and watched the steam come up clean through the new vent. She stepped onto the wooden landing and stood a long minute looking out over Devil Track Lake. She lived through the rest of that first year on the Vanlin Gold and small commissions. 15 ft cedar strip special for a retired school teacher in Beji, a thwart and yoke repair for a customer who had paddled an old Ida canoe down the squaw for 30 years. The North Shore had not forgotten her grandmother. The first summer was making the place hers, one piece at a time. The small lakeside office became a one-room living space, a folding screen dividing it. From a farm auction outside Haviland, she carried home a cast iron Glenwood cook stove for $120. A bed frame turned up at a yard sale on Highway 61 for $30. The Lutheran church basement gave up a kitchen table with Pastor Hawkinson's help. On a Sunday in August, Mrs. Berg arrived with Ida's old wool blanket in a paper bag. She gave me this the winter Cornelius died in 1981. It belongs at the shed now. Hattie laid it across the bed and did not move it. A retired Boundary Waters guide named Mr. Anno Carlson, 84, drove out one Saturday after Pastor Hawkinson mentioned that Ida's granddaughter was back. He pulled up in a dusty Chevy K10 he had owned since 1981 and said, I paddled 4 of your grandmother's canoes between 1973 and 1999. The lakeside door has dropped a half-inch from its hinges. I'll rehang it tomorrow. I won't take pay. Bring me coffee. He came back the next morning, jacked the door, set new hinges, and was gone before noon. She lay awake that first night in the office. The slap of devil track water on the wooden landing 15 ft from the door, whined through the spruce on the ridge. A loon's long cry rose once from somewhere out in the dark, and another loon answered farther off. For the first time since she was 7, she was sleeping in a place that was hers. Things found their places. Ida's 43-year forest green field jacket went on a peg above the desk. Peter's empty tin box sat on the highest shelf. The brass-handled push drill took its old position third from the left on the workbench. A new ledger went on the desk, and Hattie began entering her own canoes. June 14, 2024. Bumiji, retired school teacher, 15T cedar strip special, hall number 47, $2,800. Mr. Anno Carlson came every Saturday morning. He still drove the same Chevy K10. He came up Devil Track Lake Road with a thermos and a paper sack of his wife's lepsy. He took a cup at the table, set the lepsy on the bench, said Etta would have liked this, and drove home. In her second year, Sven Lindholm drove down from Aleli in a white Toyota Tacoma. He owned a small Boundary Waters outfitter called Northwind that rented wood canvas canoes to clients who wanted the heritage experience. He walked the form, ran his thumb along 3 finished holes on Hattie's rack, and named his terms: 6 15FT cedar strip specials a year, $2,800 a hull, delivered to Aleli. Hattie took his hand on it. The first Northwind check, when it cleared the next September, paid for her second winter at the shed. The commissions grew. Mrs. Helga Risberg, a neighbor a quarter-mile down the lake, brought choke cherry jam every August and ordered a spruce paddle every Christmas. At an estate sale in Tuef, Pastor Hawkinson found the original 1910 sign, Vanlin Boatwright, and drove it 40 m back without gas money. A heritage magazine in Duth ran a feature on her, and orders began arriving from Aleli, Beji, the Twin Cities, Madison, until she raised her prices by $200 a haul and was still booked 3 years out. By the second autumn, she had a habit of going out to the wooden landing in the last hour of daylight with a coffee mug warm in both hands. Devil Track Lake had gone steel blue with October, the spruce on the far shore burning coppery in low sun. She thought of Ida, of Peter, whom she had never met, but whose hand had laid the planks under her boots, of the long, unbroken row of hands on cedar and ash that had come down to her own. That's the thing about the trade our grandmothers teach us to keep. We do not always know when we are 6 years old and standing on a stool beside a steam box with our hand on our grandmother's belt that the standing is itself the trade. We learn it slowly, rib by rib. And then, 20 years after the old woman dies, we pull a single cedar panel from a wall she sealed and find what she has left for us. And we understand what she has been teaching us. She had been teaching us that a canoe is the wood, remembering what shape it wanted to be all along. She had been teaching us that the trade is not the canoe, the trade is the bend. The trade is the hand that learned, the hand that teaches, and the hand that comes after. Hattie Voorhees was 20 years old and broke. She had $10 to her name, and she spent it on an abandoned Boatwright's shed on the western shore of Devil Track Lake in Cook County, Minnesota. It was the best $10 she ever spent. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you loved it, we have something special for you. 12 brand new stories never released on YouTube, only available to the people who support this channel directly. Each one a full quiet road story just like this one. There's also a full audiobook available for the people who want to listen to all 12 in one place. You will find the link in the bio. We poured our whole hearts into these, and we made them for the people who truly listen. Thank you for being one of them. See you on the next Quiet.